Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition.
We should not declare a permanent rupture with our biggest customer and closest neighbor in favor of a strategic partnership for a new world order with Beijing.
Two leaders with two visions, both shaped by a U.S. president shaking up the global order. I'm Tom Perry, sitting in for Catherine Cullen. This week on the House, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has laid out his plans to counter Donald Trump and will take that message overseas to Canada's European allies. The Prime Minister is also on the road. Mark Carney once again looking to drum up new business and new partnerships abroad. Our strategists panel is standing by to compare these two visions, and we'll hear from a former top official in the Obama administration on whether Carney's push for a middle power alliance is realistic. Also on the program, can the government do more for young Canadians? There may be a lesson from the UK. We'll talk to a Future Generations Commissioner about his role. But we begin in Washington, where Donald Trump this week addressed the nation and assured his fellow Americans they're already in the midst of a new golden age. The House is now in session.
Tonight, after just 1 year, I can say with dignity and pride that we have achieved a transformation like no one has ever seen before, and a turnaround for the ages. It is indeed a turnaround for the ages.
U.S. President Donald Trump delivered his State of the Union address this week. It was long, at times combative, and chock full of questionable claims and familiar falsehoods about the economy, tariffs, and other matters. Trump went on at length about how he sees his administration reshaping America and the world. My first guest has been thinking about that reshaping and what it means for countries like Canada. Anne-Marie Slaughter is the CEO of the think tank New America and a former senior official at the U.S. State Department under the Obama administration. I spoke with her Thursday. Welcome to the House.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we heard that clip of Donald Trump saying that he's transformed the United States. And I like that quote because I remember being in the Oval Office for Mark Carney's first trip to the White House as Prime Minister when he called Trump a transformational president. And there was a lot of talk about Carney's choice of words because when you transform something, it doesn't necessarily mean you've made it better. So when you look at the U.S. today and you listen to Donald Trump's State of the Union address, how do you think this president has transformed America?
He has transformed America from the creator and champion of the post-war international system. For all its flaws, it has been the backbone of the international order and of multilateral practice for 60, 70 years. He's transformed the United States from that architect and champion to the destroyer, to the America first, transactional, interest-based, calculating, what can we get, great power that the architects of the system, tried to avoid. And ironically, he also said, America's back. And all I could think of was that's exactly what Joe Biden said after the first Trump administration. And when Joe Biden said America's back, what he meant was we are back as a multilateral power, as a leader, as a nation that values our partners and allies. And here's Donald Trump saying the same thing. It's a seesaw, but he meant we're back as America first.
You know, Trump did use his speech to underscore his fixation on tariffs. That's something Canadians were listening to. And this is despite the Supreme Court striking down his emergency import duties. So can Trump still pursue his tariff agenda with the same vigor, at least as far as you can see? And do you see countries that have shied away from retaliating against the U.S. now taking a firmer stand against it on the tariff portfolio?
He will certainly be able to still impose tariffs, but not with the same freedom. The laws he will turn to are much more restrictive. And more generally, the court has served notice that tariffs are not a plaything to be imposed at the will of the president because he doesn't like a leader or because he woke up irritated. That also means that the lawyers are now going to be much more in evidence. First of all, there are going to be a lot of companies that want to try to recover money under that they had to give up, or tariffs, the duties they had to pay under tariffs that have now been deemed to be wielded unconstitutionally. And second, yes, I think many countries are going to say, wait just a minute, you're facing opposition in your own country. This is against international law, certainly against the World Trade Organization, not that the president cares. And they've also seen that China stood up and the EU, after Greenland, threatened the bazooka. And that is, frankly, a better way to respond than capitulation.
I want to talk about Prime Minister Mark Carney and the speech that he gave at the World Economic Forum last month. It got a lot of attention. I was actually in the room at Davos when Carney spoke. Now, you've said that his message about a rupture in the world order could be the mark of a new geopolitical era. So I want to ask you, what do you see Canada's role being in this new world order?
Well, I have to say that when I listened to Mark Carney, I thought, the leader of the free world is speaking. Not that actually Canada is the leader of the free world, but those are the values that Americans like me have been proud to stand for, and frankly, proud to stand next to Canada in fighting for. I think there is a key moment. I do think that although Prime Minister Carney was a little hard on the international order, I mean, it has accomplished quite a lot. He was right to say that with the rise of many returning and emerging powers, an order that was created by the victors of World War II, when we are 20 years from the century anniversary of the end of World War II, is no longer fit for purpose. And many countries have known that for a while. I would say that the last chance we had to really reform that order and make it work was under Kofi Annan at the turn of this century, when there was a serious effort to reform the Security Council. And when that failed, then effectively we were saying, no, there's going to have to be something new. The middle powers, and that middle powers includes, it can include Canada, it can include India, it could include Chile or Peru. It's sort of anything that's not a great power or a small island state. So let's just talk about the powers that are still upholding the values of the UN Charter, even if they think the institutions are failing. They can play an important role in the General Assembly. They can play an important role in reforming UN procedures that do not require the Security Council. They can also simply come together on their own. Coalitions of the responsible is the way I would think of this. And indeed, if you take the EU, plus Switzerland and Great Britain and Norway and Canada, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, even without India, that's 42% of world GDP. That's a lot of economic power if those countries pull together, or even just the EU, Canada, Japan, Australia. That's a lot of power. And that is where different leaders can play a real role in saying, hey, we don't have to wait for the Americans.
Mark Carney is right now, he's back on the road. He's traveling to India, Japan, and Australia. How important is it for Carney to be making these kinds of trips? And I know you're talking about Carney as potentially the leader of the free world, but how much influence does the Prime Minister of Canada really have on the global stage?
Well, perhaps I should have said the representative of the free world, because I don't think he would want to style himself as the leader, but I think he is a very important leader of a world that stands for the values of the UN Charter, of sovereignty, of territorial integrity, of political independence, of nonviolence, except in self-defense, of human rights. Those are the values of the Charter. They now have to be made real for all nations. And there, I would say, it's very important that he keep this conversation going, because a speech is a speech. The real work is to do that hard diplomatic work of getting a group of nations to stand together in a way that creates a meaningful counterweight to Russia, to China, to Iran, and to a United States that is essentially saying we'll do business with anyone as long as we can advance our own interests, and we are not interested in a values-based order.
You mentioned China there, and the leader of the opposition here in Canada, Pierre Poilievre, he's saying that this is not a rupture, what we're seeing in the global order. He's also warning against Canada relying too heavily on China. So I guess I want to ask you, is that a risk, getting too involved with China? And how realistic is it for middle powers, like Canada, like others, to turn away from the U.S.?
The United States has turned away from them. I think that is it is not. Canada did not want this. The EU did not want this. It really has been it's the president who came in attacking Canada, talking about the 51st state. It's this president who, as a NATO member, who started talking about actually using force on a fellow NATO member. So in that context, I don't think it makes sense to say you're turning away from the United States. What you're doing is reasonably ensuring your own independence from any of the great powers who, regardless, it's like Ursula von der Leyen said at the Munich Security Conference, she said, Europe must be independent. She didn't mean that they wouldn't be an ally of the United States, but she said we have to be able to take care of ourselves because the United States has made very clear that it is no longer willing to pay for our defense. And I think for Canada, the United States has made very clear we are no longer willing to privilege a special trading relationship. And the United States is certainly willing to make deals with China. Canada should too, but yes, they should be careful. I would start by anchoring with the other nations who, as I said, are committed to the values of liberal democracy and of the UN Charter.
So on that idea of a rupture, then, it's obviously hard to predict these things, but do you think the U.S. is ever going to go back to the role that it once held on the world stage?
I think that the United States will find its way back to a deep understanding of the value of allies and partners and to a values-based foreign policy. This is our 250th year, the 250th year of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That starts with values. The beginning of that document, the very beginning, says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men, all human beings are created equal and are equally entitled to the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those values are, to my mind, truly part of America's DNA, but I think it could be decades before we are internally coherent enough and our democracy has been strengthened and renewed enough to play the kind of role, anything like the role that we had in the 20th century. And in the 21st century, we will, I hope, be a very important leader, but we'll never be the only one again.
I'm going to leave it there. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.
That was former U.S. State Department Director Anne-Marie Slaughter. Now, there's been some controversy over Mark Carney's trip to India. Under the Trudeau government, India had been accused of interfering in Canadian politics and was linked to the killing of a Canadian Sikh activist. But this week, a Canadian official told reporters India had changed its ways, which came as a surprise to some Canadian Sikhs. Also on the international front, Pierre Poilievre is heading to Europe for his first official overseas trip as leader of the opposition. That follows a recent speech he gave laying out the Conservative vision to deal with economic uncertainty caused by the Trump administration. Here to look into the two leaders' moves is our strategist panel. Marcy Surkes, former senior advisor to Justin Trudeau, now chief strategy officer at Compass Rose, and Kate Harrison, conservative strategist and vice chair at Summa Strategies. Welcome back to the House.
Hey, Tom.
Hey, Tom.
Marcy, there was this technical briefing leading up to this trip that Mark Carney's made to India, and a senior official told reporters that India was no longer a threat. The Minister of Foreign Affairs pushed back on that, didn't directly deny it, though, but the Sikh community is pretty upset. So is this going to derail the India trip?
This is certainly not the start to the trip that I would imagine the government had hoped for. It's always a dicey situation to find yourself in when officials seem to be contradicting what, in fact, the government and the security agencies themselves have for years in public disclosures, not only in private, but in public, have suggested that this threat is real. It continues. And certainly the previous administration, Mr. Trudeau in particular, made some very pointed allegations to this effect on the floor of the Commons. And so for it to suddenly have changed this dramatically, certainly is a little bit hard, I would think, for anybody who's been following this story to believe on its face. I'm not going to suggest that there may not be real rapprochement happening. It certainly seems to be the case. The Indian government is very much looking forward to this trip. The government of Canada, very much looking forward to getting some deals done. And they wanted this to be a clean departure, and a lot of excitement has gone into it. So this hiccup off the start of the trip, certainly unhelpful. I do think the Minister of Foreign Affairs did her best to be more clear-eyed about the situation, more pragmatic about the fact that relations with India are always going to be complicated, and we are trying to build together in spite of those differences. But the pre-brief was obviously not helpful, and I'm sure inside the government right now, they are trying to smooth things over so that the rest of this trip goes off cleaner than the start.
Kate, we're talking on Friday afternoon. Things could change by Saturday. But how do you see this affecting Mark Carney's visit?
Well, I think Marcy is correct. This is not the footing that the government wanted to begin this trip. And I think I'll be charitable in saying relations with India have been frosty, and very much so since Prime Minister Trudeau had taken office. And I like Marcy's characterization of this as an attempt at a clean break. I am reminded of the most recent trip that the Prime Minister took to China, where you may recall that there were two members of the government at the same time on a trip in Taiwan, a multi-partisan delegation to Taiwan. Those government members were asked to come back to Ottawa for fear of sending mixed signals to the Chinese administration and government ahead of that trip. I wonder if we are seeing a bit of a pattern here, Tom, in terms of an attempt to placate prospective trade partners, those with whom we have challenging and complex relationships, in an attempt to set up conversation that is fruitful and not looking at some of those challenges. I am all for principled foreign policy. Those principles need to remain consistent. So once is a coincidence and twice is a pattern. If I look at what happened in Taiwan and I see what's happening now in terms of a muddying of the complex relationship that we have with India vis-a-vis these comments, I wonder if that's not more of a strategic pattern.
Well, Kate, Pierre Poilievre is also hitting the road. He's going to be going to the UK and Germany. That comes, while the Liberals, they're enjoying a pretty substantial lead in the polls. Another Conservative MP has crossed the floor. So Poilievre's heading out on the road. What's his strategy taking this international trip now?
Yeah, I think that it was very important for Mr. Poilievre to get on the record with a realistic and solutions-oriented approach to dealing with our largest trade partner. What I heard in the comments he made before the Economic Club earlier this week was a real effort to demonstrate an understanding of the maturity of the relationship with what we have the U.S., but an acknowledgement of the reality that we are dealing with an unpredictable actor in President Trump. And he did not, he was very clear about naming the president and talking about him and didn't dance around that in any way. So I think it was important to address those concerns that Canadians have, but with an eye to how do we get back on track and how can we do so in a way that strengthens Canada's footing as opposed to being at every whim of the White House on a given day. So I think that solutions-oriented and pragmatic approach is the one that Poilievre is taking. My view is that the government is looking to play on the emotions a lot of Canadians have around how we have been treated by this White House and by the administration. And I think that Poilievre's looking a little more medium term and long term to say, I know you're upset, and that is justified, but Americans are not their president. And if we want to be serious about the future of Canadian economic growth, there's things we can control and there's things that we can't. Let's focus on those that we can.
Okay. Marcy, I'd like to ask you about Poilievre's speech in Toronto this week. As Kate points out, he did talk about Donald Trump. He responded to Mark Carney's Davos speech. He said that what we're seeing right now is not a permanent rupture with the United States. You know, Poilievre warned Canadians about turning too closely to China instead of the U.S. So do you think that Poilievre presented a real alternative to Mark Carney's vision?
I think what I would ask is, where was this kind of rhetoric a year ago when Mr. Poilievre was a real contender to form government? These are important distinctions that he's drawing. This is the kind of speech that I think most Canadians want to hear from a prime minister in waiting. Mr. Poilievre just a few weeks ago was speaking to his base in Calgary, and that was obviously a good moment for him in terms of the credibility he received from members of the Conservative Party and movement. But at the same time, the speech in Calgary was still kind of like Voldemort for the Harry Potter fans out there. He still wouldn't say the name. And now 2 weeks later, he's got suddenly a pragmatic approach, an alternative approach to deal with the Trump administration. It's good, and I think it's important for public discourse to have these different views on how to approach the most existential situation this country is facing. But in politics, as in life, timing is everything. And it does feel a little late in the day for Mr. Poilievre to be showing up suddenly, proclaiming to be a prime minister and waiting when he had the chance a year ago and squandered it.
Kate, you want to get in there?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that many Canadians did not necessarily anticipate, and I believe neither perhaps the Prime Minister or certainly Mr. Poilievre anticipated that, approaching 1 year on, we may still be having this discussion. I think that part of the Prime Minister's sales pitch was that he would look for a quick resolution and a new economic and security partnership with the president. In his role as opposition leader, it would be inappropriate to be at the front of that delegation. That is the role and responsibility of the Prime Minister. I think at this point, with time going on and time passing, it's important for him to get out there. I think the effort on the trade negotiation front must continue to be led by the government. But I wouldn't be surprised to see Mr. Poilievre, yes, he's got some international travel coming. I wouldn't be surprised to see him also look to do some travel within the United States to build up those relationships on the other side of the border. I think it's a balance. You have to let the government be the lead. And for a while, this was the number one priority. I'm not sure that that's where we are right now. It seems like we're slow rolling conversations with the United States ahead of the Kuzma review as opposed to looking for something in the short term.
But do you think that Poilievre was reluctant to talk about Donald Trump because he was worried about alienating part of his base? And do you think that by going out there now and talking about him, that that's going to be enough to convince Canadians that he's the guy to take on Trump?
I think that the sweet spot for a lot of Conservatives and for Mr. Poilievre in particular is on domestic issues. What I observed in the speech was a clear connection between how the unpredictability of what's happening south of the border is going to have a consequence for Canada's economy. So therefore, what can we control to strengthen that? And I think that where you will see the contrast between what Mr. Poilievre is talking about vis-a-vis Donald Trump in the United States, vice the Prime Minister, one is on pragmatism and emotion. But I do think that there will be a more deliberate effort on the part of Pierre Poilievre to connect this to some of our domestic challenges, as opposed to, seek to do a ton of international trips that don't result in more material benefit for Canada.
Marcy, I want to just get your thoughts on that. And also, do you think this is going to make things better for Pierre Poilievre? We've had the floor crossers. Do you think that he's managed to right the ship?
I think that he has got to play for time. And if there is an opportunity to right the ship, it needs at least 6 to 12 months now to ripen for him. He is coming from behind, way behind. Canadians at this point seem to have invested entirely in Mr. Carney and his ability to manage not only the United States, but the geopolitical situation writ large. And so Mr. Poilievre, maybe he's turned the corner, but his best case scenario is that he doesn't face the electorate anytime soon.
Going to leave it there, guys. Marcy, Kate, thanks for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tom.
That was Kate Harrison of Summa Strategies and Marcy Sirks of Compass Rose. Lots more coming up on the House podcast, including Canada's ambassador to Ukraine on the harrowing stories she hears on the ground as the country enters a 5th year of war. I'm Tom Perry. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Tell us what you think of the show. You can email us at thehouse@cbc.ca. Both Canada and BC's governments are still demanding answers from OpenAI. The company didn't warn police about the Tumbler Ridge shooter's activity on its ChatGPT platform before the deadly attack earlier this month. OpenAI says it's made internal changes and would alert authorities if similar posts were made today. Here to help unpack what OpenAI is doing and what more could be done is Murad Hemati. He's the AI reporter for The Logic. Thanks for your time.
Hey, Tom, great to be here.
So OpenAI says it's making changes. Do we know what these changes are and if they'll make any difference?
Yeah, so last June when the user was sending these messages, they weren't reported to law enforcement because OpenAI didn't believe they met the criteria that they'd set, which was a, quote, credible and imminent threat of harm to others. And so what they've done is revise those criteria so that they're not reading it so that they would need to name a specific target, a specific means, or a specific timing of violence. And those things weren't apparently, the implication is present in the original messages, and that's why they weren't referred. They've also said that they're going to establish a direct point of contact with law enforcement in Canada. They're going to take into account, quote, country and community context. It's unclear exactly what that means, but also that, there's going to be more effort to refer people to local resources when they're having mental health issues or something of that sort. These criteria could conceivably, depending on the case, make a difference. But the direct link between the use of this tool, ChatGPT as it were, and the violence, we're still not entirely clear on what the user said to ChatGPT, what ChatGPT said back, and what it was that caused these humans who were reviewing the messages after they'd been escalated by this automated review system to be concerned and to consider the possibility of referral. In the absence of the actual messages or some more context about what they were, it's hard to say, what the criteria will mean for future cases.
After OpenAI sent its letter, we heard from BC Premier David Eby. He talked to reporters about what he thinks needs to happen with tech firms in the wake of the tragedy in his province. Here's some of what he said.
The consequences of that will be borne by the people of Tumbler Ridge, the families of Tumbler Ridge, for the rest of their lives. These are not small stakes. And it illustrates why these companies cannot be trusted to set their own reporting thresholds, and especially to set their own thresholds where there are no apparent consequences for not meeting them.
So that's BC Premier David Eby. And what he's saying is that these companies can't be trusted to self-regulate. He's calling for some kind of national standard. So what could Canada do on that?
Yeah, and it's interesting that this is a similar debate than the one that's been happening around social media platforms for the longest time, right? There is an AI tool in use in this particular example, but it's not actually limited to AI. The AI doesn't really come into what went wrong here. What went wrong was that a company didn't meet what policymakers think is a reasonable threshold for reporting. So, governments could try to create some kind of threshold for reporting, whether that is legislatively or through regulation or through some agreed upon industry standard.
Is there a model out there that Canada could follow? Are there other countries that are doing something that could make a difference on this?
So far, the conversation around AI regulation in terms of harms has typically focused on something called chatbot psychosis, which is the idea that talking to these systems might be at best failing to help or at worst worsening mental health issues like suicidal ideation or depression that their users might have. Again, there's been some talk of limits on how children can use these or ensuring that these systems are reminding their users that they're not not human, that they are AI, so that they don't feel a false sense of empathy or a false sense of building a relationship with these chatbots. Again, none of that really has to do with what happened here, because we don't know what the chatbot said back to the user in the Tumbler Ridge case, and it's not clear that reminding the user that it was AI would have made any difference.
So we don't know what the answer is at this point.
No, and I think this goes to this bigger issue in tech regulation over the last, call it, decade. It's unfortunate, but I want to draw us back to another tragedy, the Christchurch mosque shooting in 2019, when a whole bunch of world leaders stirred up and said, enough is enough. Tech platforms need to be responsible for what happens on them. We can't allow terrorist propaganda or, ideological extremism to spread on these platforms. And then very little happened after that in terms of concrete regulation. There's some stuff that happened in the EU, which, the American government and American tech companies have pushed back on. Canada hasn't passed its own law. I mean, there have been 5 heritage ministers and 4 justice ministers since online harms was first put on the agenda by a Liberal government. It seems like in the wake of a tragedy, there's this push for action, and then we haven't really seen a lot of action.
Murad, thanks so much for your time on this.
Thank you for having me.
Murad Hamadi is an AI reporter at The Logic.
So in the future, I do want to be a teacher. There's a lot of, you have to go to teachers college, university, and then you can also take extra courses. That means, I have to also maybe want to save up money to help my mom out to pay for it. I'm worried about the fact that I feel like you have to lower the price of schools and where you can, learn and get degrees to get jobs.
There's no doubt young people face a lot of challenges. We just talked on the program about AI, but there's also concerns about the cost of education, groceries, not to mention the challenges of climate change. In some parts of the world, governments are making sure someone is looking out for future generations, and advocates say Canada should do the same. The CBC's Benjamin Lopez-Steven has been looking into this, and he brings us this story.
How do we feel about the health of our Earth?
I've seen a lot online about polar bears, and how their environment is melting, and how there's very few polar bears left, and how, you'll see videos of polar bears, that are very, very skinny, and, how...
In this grade 8 class at St. Mother Teresa High School in Ottawa, students share what worries them most about the future, at a time when kids are supposed to just be kids.
When we're at home, we, talk about how the prices are always going up. When I'm older, I feel like I won't have enough money to, afford all the stuff I need and, the groceries I need.
Gas is also going, really, really high. And also, my dad is a mechanic, so, I see a lot on how much, you have to pay a lot of money for a car and a lot of money to keep the car running and to get it fixed and to get gas.
Well, I feel like I watch a lot of, news and watch the political things, and I feel like the prices of rent, the prices of housing, the financing is super, super high compared to the average income in Canada. I'm not per se worried right now because obviously I'm 13. I don't have to worry about that stuff until later. But I feel like if the government doesn't do anything, it's just going to get worse and worse. So I'm definitely more nervous.
Even at the age of 13, these students have a lot on their minds. And their teacher, 31-year-old Katie Richmeyer, is also worried for this young generation.
I did not have those concerns when I was their age. And their parents are millennials, and they're talking about the struggles that they're having. And it's nice to know that they're aware, but it's also really heartbreaking that they're being exposed to this so young. And
Richmeyer believes governments aren't thinking of this younger cohort in their decision-making.
So many times I look at things that the government is doing, and I'm like, who is this for? It's not for me. It's not for, the average voter. It feels like it's a lot for older voters. And it worries me because as a teacher with these kids every single day, I'm like, this is going to hurt them in the long run, and it's hurting my generation. And when does it get better?
Right now, Canada's government is dealing with many urgent issues. But does that mean there isn't time to consider the needs of future generations? That's something the government in Wales has been thinking about.
You're advocating for the rights of people not yet born, people who don't have a vote, and you're making sure that their interests are considered in decision making. So my role is just part.
Derek Walker is the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales. His job is to be a watchdog to the Welsh government and challenge it to think long term, really long term.
Why should we be leaving the problems of today for our children and our grandchildren to fix when we could be fixing them today? It's not fair for us to be taking advantage and leaving them to fix the problems that we could be fixing ourselves.
Walker says he's been able to recommend the Welsh government take action on things like river pollution and the sustainability of its food system, but he's most proud of his work on boosting wages.
So we see high levels of poverty in Wales, and I asked our public sector organisations to pay the real living wage, pay higher levels of wages than they were currently doing so. And we had something like 90% commitment now to the public sector organisations doing that. And that's going to make a massive difference in people's pockets and do something very important to addressing endemic levels of poverty right across our country.
But there are shortcomings to his role. In a report last year, Wales's Auditor General said there's enthusiasm around the bill that created Walker's job, but it's not driving the system-wide change that was intended. It's for that reason that Canadian advocates want Canada to go further than Wales. Paul Kershaw is a professor at the University of British Columbia and the founder of Generation Squeeze.
Effectively, legislation to safeguard the well-being of younger and future generations would do at the cabinet table, federally and provincially, what every parent and grandparent does at their family table. They're there looking out for what is the future prospects going to be for my kids and grandchildren. Do I at certain moments need to make sacrifices for them? Well, that's what I'm on board to do, because that's what intergenerational love from parents and grandparents means. We just need to make sure that we bring that intergenerational love to the world of politics, because right now the exact opposite is happening.
Alongside a commissioner, Kershaw believes Canada needs someone sitting at the cabinet table to look out for future generations.
Power is wielded in government within government, and we ultimately need to have a minister responsible for intergenerational fairness, so that on a day in, day out basis, and especially at cabinet meetings, that person is responsible for bringing the lens. Are we legislating in a way that is falling subject to the short-term cynicism of our 4-year electoral cycle? Or are we budgeting and planning for 7 generations and thinking into the long term and not sacrificing the health and well-being of today's young people and future generations for some short-term political gain?
Do you think anyone in government right now is really thinking about the needs of young people in this country?
So absolutely. I meet with MPs and ministers all the time who are deeply concerned about younger Canadians. But if we read the budget, it is beyond contestation that we are prioritizing investments for an aging population at a scale of urgency that makes what we're doing for younger people seem absolutely minuscule. I mean, the budget will show that between now and 2029, we are going to increase annual spending on old age security by about $30 billion a year. By comparison, youth employment investments get less than $1 billion. Post-secondary gets a little more than $1 billion. Housing gets a little more than $1 billion. And childcare, which was an historic investment, will get a few billion. So when you look at the priorities for younger people, they get really rounding errors on what we're doing in terms of investments for older people.
Last May, Prime Minister Mark Carney unveiled a new cabinet committee to focus on Canadians' quality of life and well-being. Kershaw hopes it can start to deliver on his generational fairness goals. Also, Senator Rosemary Moody has tabled a Senate bill to get Canada to create a national strategy for children and youth.
Children don't vote. Children don't have a voice in the decisions their governments are making.
It may not become law, but Moody wants to make sure Canada's youngest generations aren't forgotten, no matter what problems take up Ottawa's attention.
I think that the challenge becomes for us, the advocates, the civil society advocates, the parliamentarians who advocate, is to keep beating the drum, keep those issues at the forefront, make sure that we are continuing to try to move the needle on some of these issues, even while they're not the priority.
Whether Canada tries a strategy, a commissioner, or a minister, these 13-year-olds would like someone else to take over worrying about the future.
I think that we shouldn't have to worry about these things, but I feel like we do because of how much stuff isn't affordable and how much our parents talk about it, so we hear it too.
I just feel like it's not right that we are thinking about this mature stuff. I don't think it's our place, but it is at the same time, because we are the future generation.
Students at St. Mother Teresa High School talking to the House's Benjamin Lopez Stephen.
I think that people are ready for any compromises in which they don't lose dignity and independence of country.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky speaking with Radio-Canada as his country marked 4 years this week since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. As a fifth year of war begins and as peace talks remain deadlocked, what does the road ahead look like? Natalka Simok has been serving as Canada's ambassador to Ukraine since 2023. She's in Kyiv. Ambassador, welcome to the House.
Thank you very much for having me. I think it's a very important time to be speaking, so I appreciate the invitation.
Ambassador, over the last few months, entire swaths of Ukraine have endured blackouts, no heat, and of course continued attacks. What's been the most challenging part of living through this winter in Kyiv?
So I'll just start off by saying that this past year was the deadliest year since the full-scale invasion. It's seen an increase of 31% of civilian deaths, which is significant. And it's largely just from what you described because of the intensity of the airstrikes. It feels how generals have described it is it seems to have changed tactics as to more like increasing as much damage as they can. And as you noted, in particular, the energy and heating has been severely affected because it has been such a cold winter. So, just to give you a sense, like Ukraine, from what I understand, is now operating about 20% of its capacity. And in a city like Kyiv, it now relies on bringing in power from other parts of Ukraine. So it was a very serious and intense winter.
You're on the ground, you're speaking to Ukrainians every day. Is there a story that you've heard that you think Canadians should hear to help them understand what the situation is?
Gosh, I have two very concrete ones. So one is just hearing of the stories of the humanitarian workers who are trying their best to reach all the people who are desperate for assistance. So on the coldest nights, you hear of these tragic stories of like an 85-year-old woman, like grandmother Zhenya, who ended up dying, freezing to death in her apartment because it didn't take long for people to freeze when the heat was out. And it's just devastating to humanitarian workers who are doing their absolute best. But it was really challenging to meet every single member of the community because, as you know, the most vulnerable are the ones who stayed. So although people were encouraged to leave the city when they could, not everyone was able to. So it tends to be those in wheelchairs or with other disabilities who couldn't move, or the elderly who didn't have that kind of support who was most impacted. And unfortunately, that's just one story of many. Another I'd just like to share is that just last week I met with returned prisoners of war. So it's really nice that you're seeing these returns actually happening, but hearing their stories, it's really hard to hear what they've overcome. But they really are incredible people, what they've endured, and come back and so willing to share with others so that the world is aware of what they've lived through.
What have they lived through? What are you hearing from them?
So this is not the first group of prisoners of war who have been returned, and this includes also civilians that I've spoken to, and I've also met with children who have been returned. Their stories are consistent, and in fact, a UN report just this September released showing that it actually is systemic torture that these captives are enduring. So wherever you are imprisoned, you are facing similar kind of treatment. And over 98% have endured torture. And the gentlemen that I met with, they said that it's systemic. They all have at least one day of the month where they are going to go through 4 to 5 hours of intense torture. I won't describe them here. They're horrible. Many of them are sexual in nature. They're not fed enough. They have no contact with their family. So it's a human tragic story, and I speak of it because it's one that, as part of Canadian leadership of the human dimension, it's something that is really important to Canada, but to me personally as well.
We heard that clip of President Zelensky. He was talking about compromise. But when you hear stories like that, is compromise possible? What are you hearing from Ukrainians on that?
Gosh, that's such a tough question. So recently, a survey was done in Ukraine, and in fact, every time things get tougher, the people here actually get angrier and more determined to live through it. So, for example, 72% of people in the last survey had said they will approve a peace plan that freezes the front line, but only if it includes binding international security guarantees. So 69% of Ukrainians think that these current negotiations will lead to lasting peace, but they are not budging. So they do not want to see compromise. They want to see binding security guarantees that will make sure that this is sustainable because truthfully, they do not trust Russia, that Russia will keep its word.
The Canadian government this week pledged further support for Ukraine. It's $2 billion in military assistance, more sanctions on Russia, and this renewed commitment for Canada's military to help train Ukrainian troops. At the same time, though, we're hearing these stories that you just told about torture. We're hearing stories about brutal tactics by the Russians, sending wave after wave of soldiers against Ukrainian lines to try to essentially expend ammunition. So when you hear stories like that, how much difference does Canada's contribution really make to this kind of brutal war?
So I just like to point out that what makes all of this tragic is that the kind of losses we're seeing, in particular on the Russian side, I've heard 1,000 soldiers a day. And since last year, so over 1 year, I understand it's like 1% of territorial gain for 1,000 soldiers a day. So their losses in terms of people, in terms of their economy on the Russian side is huge. Another statistic, just to give you a sense of the difference, because they have different approach. Ukraine has changed its approach. Ukraine soldiers actually spend a lot of time valuing and saving the lives for every soldier. So from what I understand, the survival ratio, so for Ukraine, of every one soldier, five are saved, and in Russia it's 1 to 1. So there's just much more effort that Ukrainians are spending to make sure that they have as high of a survival rate as they can. Now, partly what this is attributed to is their incredible innovation. So they're now using robotics much more, so unarmed vehicles to come and extract people or bring support. So Ukrainians are spending their innovation in being able to do that. Drones, everyone talks about drones. I mean, the changes that we've seen even in the last year is just incredible. I mean, I understand that in the first year they were producing maybe, 2,000 a year, and now it's 5,000 a day. So it's crazy on both sides. The war has changed. But to answer your question, I mean, yes, of course it's making a huge difference because Canada is not alone. I think that Prime Minister Carney spoke about this very well at Davos, actually, that it is about alliance. And so what Ukraine has on its side is the alliance of the coalition of the willing and others. And that is making a huge difference. Another one, of course, is the investment into Pearl. So it's the priority list of getting the kind of support that Ukraine has identified. And we collectively get, especially, well, what we're talking about is air defense primarily and ammunition to make sure that Ukraine has what it has. So it is making a difference. And I think that working together is making a difference. And when I was discussing this with some of the military here, they were thrilled to hear about the extension of Op Unifier, saying, because it's been extended until 2029. It is very much valued as training, as mentorship, and Canada has built up the trust of the Ukrainian military. So I think we are seen as reliable partners. And in fact, Forbes Ukraine has listed and has described Canada as a trusted partner. So we have a very good reputation here for good reason.
President Zelensky said he expects more three-way negotiations as soon as next week with the Ukrainians, the Russians, and the Americans all at the table, and another summit with Putin and Donald Trump to follow. But really nothing came out of Donald Trump's last summit with Putin. So I guess the question is for you, what do you think needs to happen to get to the end of this war?
So Ukrainians are feeling actually quite optimistic about these talks. And in fact, the new chief of staff, Budanov, spoke at a conference earlier this week and spoke quite positively of it in terms of the conversations, because basically he described it as, sure, they're trilateral, but it really is Russia and Ukraine now speaking directly and on with delegations that are serious with the U.S. there as very important and and valued mediators. So they're feeling very positive, and like you probably have heard, they have two tracks, the political track and the military track. But like he points out, that look, after 12 years of war, we can't expect that, it's going to take 1 to 2 meetings and come to a negotiation. It's going to take several of these meetings to progress to that point. But he felt, or he described it at the conference, that those meetings are leading to progress, and he's feeling very confident about it. I think everybody wants to see a leader level meeting at the right time. He described that they're, hoping to have a date or a goal for that meeting soon. But what that goal is, I don't have that information. But the point is, I think that they're feeling optimistic that these conversations are taking place, and that he described it as genuine conversations.
I'm going to leave it there. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time today.
Okay, thank you very much.
Canada's ambassador to Ukraine, Natalka Simak. That's it for us this week. Our crew on the House is Emma Godmere, Ethan Lang, Benjamin Lopez-Steven, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Miguel Plant. I'm Tom Perry. Thanks for listening.